sound of wind whistling over ancient ruins, subtle, deep orchestral score begins. Narrator: the mid-12th century Levant was a crucible of competing ambitions, a geopolitical mosaic fragmented by centuries of internal strife and external pressures. From the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the verdant coastlines of the Mediterranean, no single power held undisputed sway. Instead, a complex tapestry of states vied for dominance: the Latin Crusader kingdoms, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and the recently lost Edessa, asserting their presence along the coast, the remnants of the once mighty Seljuk Sultanate, now fractured into numerous emirates, and the venerable, yet increasingly fragile, Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. This was a land of constant flux, where alliances shifted with the desert winds, and the very concept of stable governance was a fleeting ideal. It was upon this stage of profound disunity that a new form of steadfast leadership would emerge. Visual, animated maps showing the fragmented Levant, highlighting the various Crusader states, Seljuk emirates, and Fatimid territories. Arrows indicate constant skirmishes and shifting borders. Narrator: for decades, this strategic vacuum had been exploited by opportunistic rulers and formidable warlords. Among them, Imad ad-Din Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo, had carved out a formidable domain through sheer military prowess and an uncompromising will. Zengi was a commander of brutal efficiency, whose campaigns, meticulously documented by chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir, demonstrated a keen understanding of siege warfare and the psychological impact of relentless aggression. His capture of the Crusader county of Edessa in 1144, a pivotal event that triggered the Second Crusade from Europe, underscored his capacity to challenge the Frankish presence directly, sending shockwaves across both the Latin West and the fractured Islamic East. He was a force of nature, consolidating territories and imposing a stern, yet effective, order within his expanding realm. Visual, a depiction of Zengi, perhaps a historical illustration or a CGI rendering, looking stern and authoritative. Focus on siege tactics at Edessa, showing historical maps and troop movements. Narrator: Zengi's ambition, however, was also his vulnerability. In September of 1146, while besieging the fortress of Kalat Jabbar in northern Syria, his formidable career was brought to an abrupt and violent end. He was assassinated by a disgruntled Frankish slave in his service, a sudden act that plunged his vast, newly consolidated territories into immediate disarray. The news spread like wildfire, threatening to unravel the fragile unity he had forged. His commanders, many of them Mamluks loyal to his person rather than an abstract state, faced a stark choice: maintain cohesion or succumb to the inevitable scramble for power. Visual, close-up on a historical map, showing Kalat Jabbar. A dramatic, yet historically accurate, illustration of Zengi's assassination, avoiding sensationalism. Emphasize the immediate confusion among his troops. Narrator: at the time of his father's death, one of Zengi's sons, Nur Adin Mahmud, was present near the camp. He was a young man, barely 29 years old, who had inherited his father's strategic mind, but possessed a temperament markedly different from his father's famed severity. While his elder brother, Saif ad-Din Ghazi, immediately moved to secure Mosul, the traditional seat of their father's power, Nur ad-Din swiftly grasped the immediate and critical imperative: Aleppo. This ancient city, a vital strategic and economic hub, was not only vulnerable to opportunistic Crusader incursions from Antioch, but also to internal dissent. Visual, a portrait of a young Nur ad-Din, perhaps an artistic rendering based on descriptions. Overlay with a map showing Aleppo's strategic location relative to Antioch and Mosul. Text overlay highlighting his age and immediate actions. Narrator: Nur ad-Din's response was a masterclass in pragmatic leadership under duress. Recognizing the immense psychological impact of his father's death, he acted with a quiet determination that belied his youth. He quickly rallied loyal elements of his father's army, particularly the Mamluks and emirs who had served Zengi directly. His initial challenge was not just external, but internal, securing the loyalty of a fragmented command structure and the populace of Aleppo itself. He understood that legitimacy, in this fractured world, was often a matter of immediate presence and decisive action. Visual depiction of Nur ad-Din addressing his commanders, emphasizing his calm demeanor. Show logistical challenges, securing supplies, maintaining order in the city, fortifying defenses. Use historical accounts from Ibn al-Athir or Ibn Kathir to illustrate the immediate chaos and Nur ad-Din's steadying influence. Narrator: while his brother Ghazi consolidated power in Mosul, Nur ad-Din focused on Aleppo, a city that formed the northern bulwark against the Latin states. His immediate strategic objective was clear: prevent the loss of any more territory. The Prince of Antioch, Raymond de Poitiers, predictably saw Zengi's death as an opportunity. He launched an aggressive campaign into Muslim territories east of the Orontes River, aiming to reclaim areas lost to Zengi. Nur ad-Din, however, was prepared. He had moved quickly to secure key fortresses and rally his forces. His initial engagements against Raymond were not about grand conquest, but about demonstrating resolve and defending his inherited domain. He engaged Raymond's forces in a series of calculated skirmishes and defensive maneuvers, preventing any significant Crusader gains and sending a clear message: Zengi's legacy, though fractured, was not broken. Visual, animated map showing Raymond of Antioch's movements and Nur ad-Din's defensive counter-movements. Highlight key border fortresses. Focus on the strategic implications of these early defensive actions. Narrator: this period following his father's assassination was foundational for Nur ad-Din. It revealed a leader capable of swift decision-making, an astute understanding of military logistics, and a profound sense of responsibility for his people. He had inherited not a unified empire, but a contested inheritance, surrounded by opportunistic rivals and the ever-present threat of the Crusader states. The fractured Levant was indeed his stage, and his initial actions demonstrated a quiet steadfastness, setting the precedent for a rule that would seek to unite these disparate lands through a combination of military genius, diplomatic skill, and unwavering determination. The scene was set for a struggle that would define the era. Sound of orchestral score swells slightly, then fades to silence. Narrator 1146 AD. The sudden assassination of Imad ad-Din Zengi by his own slaves left a geopolitical vacuum that threatened to collapse the nascent Zengid state. In the brutal logic of 12th century succession, power was not inherited, it was seized. While his elder brother, Saif ad-Din, moved to secure the ancestral power base of Mosul, the younger son, Nur Adin Mahmud, rode with a hand-picked contingent of cavalry toward Aleppo. He did not carry a crown, but his father's signet ring and a cold, analytical understanding of the Levant's geography. This is the story of a man who realized that to defeat the Crusader states, he first had to master the logistics of his own fractured house. Title card: Foundations of Power, Fortresses, Alliances, and Calculated Restraint. Narrator: Aleppo in 1146 was a city of immense strategic value but crumbling infrastructure. Situated at the crossroads of the Silk Road and the Mediterranean trade routes, it was the gateway to the Crusader Principality of Antioch. However, as the historian Ibn Kathir records, the city Nur ad-Din inherited was exhausted by decades of intermittent siege and neglect. Nur ad-Din's first tactical decision was not a military campaign, but a massive engineering project. He understood a fundamental principle of medieval warfare: the field army is only as strong as its logistical base. He poured the city's revenues into the reconstruction of the walls and the reinforcement of the citadel. Using the natural limestone of the region, he created a defensive complex that served as both a psychological deterrent and a secure depot for grain and armaments. Strategic analysis asterisk. From a military perspective, Nur ad-Din's early years were defined by interior lines. By holding Aleppo, he occupied the center of a semicircle of Crusader territories: Edessa to the north, Antioch to the west, and the county of Tripoli to the south. This allowed him to shift his forces rapidly between fronts, while his enemies, separated by rugged terrain and competing interests, struggled to coordinate. But walls and geography were only half the equation. Nur ad-Din faced a psychological hurdle: the deep-seated distrust of the local Damascene and Aleppan elites toward the Turkic Zengid dynasty. Narrator: The geopolitical reality of the Levant was a kaleidoscope of shifting loyalties. To the south lay Damascus, ruled by the Berid dynasty, who often preferred a cautious alliance with the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem over submission to a Zengid strongman. In 1148, the arrival of the Second Crusade, led by Conrad III of Germany and Louis VII of France, presented Nur ad-Din with a moment of supreme tactical tension. The Crusaders laid siege to Damascus. For Nur ad-Din, this was a moment of calculated restraint. A lesser commander might have rushed to the city's gates to claim the glory of its defense, risking his army in a pitched battle against the combined chivalry of Europe. Instead, Nur ad-Din waited. He moved his forces to Homs, positioning himself close enough to threaten the Crusader supply lines, but far enough to avoid being drawn into a meat grinder. He communicated with the rulers of Damascus, offering help but demanding a price: the recognition of his suzerainty. As the Crusader siege collapsed due to internal friction and poor logistics, Nur ad-Din emerged as the only leader capable of projecting power without firing a single arrow. He had allowed his enemies to defeat themselves. The Battle of Inab, 1149. The restraint shown at Damascus was followed by a display of surgical violence. In 1149, Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch and one of the most formidable warriors of the era, sought to expand his eastern frontier. Nur ad-Din's intelligence network, a sophisticated system of mounted couriers and pigeon posts described by contemporary chroniclers, alerted him to Raymond's movements. At the Battle of Inab, Nur ad-Din demonstrated his tactical evolution. He utilized the classic step tactic of the encirclement, but with a disciplined infantry corps that prevented the Crusader knights from breaking out. The terrain was exploited perfectly. Raymond's forces were trapped in a valley near the spring of Inab. The result was a total tactical collapse for the Latins. Raymond of Poitiers was killed in the fray. Ibn Kathir notes that Nur ad-Din sent the silver-encased arm of the prince to the caliph in Baghdad, not as a religious trophy, but as a diplomatic statement of his rising primacy. Psychological analysis, asterisk. What drove this man? Unlike his father, who was known for a volatile temperament and a taste for wine, Nur ad-Din adopted a persona of extreme austerity. Historians analyze this as a deliberate political tool. In a world of flamboyant warlords, his calculated asceticism served to unify the diverse elements of his state. By appearing as a servant of the law rather than a seeker of personal wealth, he gained the moral high ground necessary to absorb rival Muslim city-states. He was a master of the long game. He spent the early 1150s not in grand conquests, but in the minutiae of governance. He established bimaristans, hospitals, and madrasas, legal colleges. To a modern strategist, these were not merely charitable acts. They were the soft power infrastructure that stabilized his rear. By providing justice and services that the Crusader lords could not match, he ensured that the local population would remain loyal during the protracted wars to come. Narrator. By 1154, the foundations were complete. Through a combination of defensive fortification, the exploitation of Crusader diplomatic errors, and the crushing victory at Inab, Nur ad-Din had turned a fragile inheritance into a regional hegemony. The final piece of the Syrian puzzle remained Damascus. The city's rulers were bankrupt and terrified. On April 18, 1154, the citizens of Damascus, weary of the Berids' inability to provide security, opened the gates to Nur ad-Din's forces. For the first time since the arrival of the First Crusade, the two great Syrian power centers, Aleppo and Damascus, were united under a single command. The strategic encirclement of the Crusader states was no longer a theory, it was a reality. Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi had built the anvil. Now he needed to find the hammer. Fade to black. #3. The siege of Damascus. Ambition checked, strategy refined. The narrative of Nur Adin Mahmud Zengi is one of relentless ambition, tempered by strategic patience and a profound understanding of the human and political landscape of the Levant. Having consolidated his hold on Aleppo and much of northern Syria, Nur ad-Din cast his gaze southward towards Damascus. This ancient city, a jewel of the Near East, represented not merely a territorial prize, but the strategic linchpin for any unified Muslim response to the encroaching Crusader states. Its fertile Ghouta, its wealth, and its position as a gateway to Egypt and Palestine made it an indispensable component of Nur ad-Din's grand vision. Yet Damascus proved to be a formidable and frustrating challenge, a testament to the complex geopolitics of the era. In the wake of his father Imad ad-Din Zengi's assassination in 1146, Nur ad-Din had moved decisively to secure Aleppo. His subsequent victory at Inab in 1149, where he decisively defeated Raymond of Antioch, further solidified his reputation and military prowess. This success, however, did not immediately translate into control over Damascus. The city, under the buried emir Mujia ad-Din Abak, was a precarious, independent entity, often caught between the rising power of Nur ad-Din and the opportunistic alliances with the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Nur ad-Din's initial attempts to absorb Damascus were direct, reflecting the assertive military tactics that had brought him success elsewhere. In 1149, following a period of Damascene weakness and the death of its powerful regent Mine ad-Din Nur, Nur ad-Din marched on the city. He viewed its continued independence, especially its willingness to forge pacts with the Franks, as a strategic vulnerability and an affront to the broader Muslim cause. However, the Damascenes, despite internal divisions, fiercely guarded their autonomy. Faced with Nur ad-Din's advance, Mujia ad-Din Abak, echoing a long-standing buried policy, sought aid from Jerusalem. The Franks, ever pragmatic, saw an opportunity to maintain a weakened buffer state on their northern frontier, and their intervention forced Nur ad-Din to withdraw. This was a clear check on his ambition, a stark reminder that military might alone was insufficient to bend Damascus to his will. This initial setback, recorded by contemporary chroniclers such as Ibn al-Athir, marked a crucial turning point in Nur ad-Din's strategic thinking. It forced him to reassess his approach, moving beyond brute force towards a more nuanced strategy of political maneuvering, economic pressure, and psychological warfare. He recognized that Damascus, with its proud history and strong sense of identity, could not be simply conquered. It had to be won over. Over the next 4 years, Nur ad-Din refined his strategy. He focused on consolidating his existing territories, strengthening his administration, and building a loyal, disciplined army. Crucially, he observed the deteriorating situation in Damascus. Mujia ad-Din Abak proved an increasingly ineffectual ruler, his reliance on Frankish protection growing more overt and unpopular among his own people. The Franks, despite their alliance, continued their opportunistic raids on the fertile Ghouta, devastating the Damascene countryside and further eroding Mujia ad-Din's legitimacy. These incursions, often detailed by chroniclers like Ibn Kathir, highlighted the Damascene ruler's inability to protect his subjects, even with foreign aid. Nur ad-Din skillfully exploited this growing discontent. His propaganda portrayed Mujia ad-Din as a puppet of the Franks, a ruler who had betrayed his people by inviting infidel forces into Muslim lands. He positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, the rightful leader destined to unify Syria and repel the Crusader threat. This narrative resonated deeply with a populace weary of instability and increasingly resentful of their rulers' perceived weakness and subservience. The human cost of this prolonged uncertainty was immense. Constant raids and political machinations created an atmosphere of fear and economic hardship for the ordinary Damascene. The culmination of this refined strategy came in 1154. Frankish depredations against the Gauta reached an intolerable level, triggering widespread outrage within Damascus. The populace, disillusioned and desperate for effective leadership, finally turned against Mujia ad-Din. Nur ad-Din, seizing the opportune moment, marched on Damascus once more. This time, his approach was meticulously crafted. He did not launch a full-scale assault. Instead, his disciplined forces encamped outside the city, projecting an image of order and strength, while crucially forbidding any looting or aggression against the local population. The internal dynamics of Damascus played directly into his hands. Disaffected elements within the city, weary of Mujia ad-Din's misrule and the constant Frankish threat, actively conspired with Nur ad-Din. Contemporary accounts, particularly from Ibn al-Athir, describe how the city's gates were opened from within, allowing Nur ad-Din's forces to enter without significant resistance. Mujia ad-Din aback, abandoned by his own people, was forced to capitulate. Nur ad-Din, demonstrating remarkable political sagacity, did not treat him as a vanquished foe. Instead, he allowed Mujia ad-Din to depart with his family and possessions, even granting him a minor fief in Homs, a pragmatic move designed to ensure a smooth transition of power and avoid unnecessary bloodshed or protracted resistance. Nur ad-Din's entry into Damascus in April 1154 marked a watershed moment. His ambition, initially checked by the city's stubborn independence and Frankish intervention, was finally realized through a strategy that prioritized political acumen and popular support over sheer military might. The unification of Muslim Syria from Aleppo to Damascus under a single, strong ruler provided the essential strategic depth and consolidated resources needed to confront the Crusader states effectively. This campaign profoundly shaped Nur ad-Din's leadership. He emerged not just as a formidable warrior, but as a statesman who understood the intricate balance of power, the importance of legitimacy, and the enduring human desire for security and effective governance. The siege of Damascus, therefore, stands as a testament to Nur ad-Din's evolving genius, a period where ambition was tempered by a refined strategy, ultimately paving the way for his ascendancy as the preeminent Muslim leader of his era. Chapter 4: The Philosophy of the Unshaken Pillar, Patience, Pragmatism, and Piety. The Architecture of Power. When Nur ad-Din Mahmud assumed control of Aleppo in 1146, he inherited not a kingdom, but a strategic dilemma. The Zengid state his father had forged was surrounded. Crusader principalities to the west, the Seljuk Empire fragmenting to the east, and the Fatimid Caliphate weakening to the south. Lesser rulers might have pursued glory through immediate conquest. Nur ad-Din chose differently. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir, who lived through this period, observed that Nur ad-Din never undertook any action without first considering its consequences. This was not mere caution, it was calculated strategic patience. Where his father Imad ad-Din Zengi had been a hammer, Nur ad-Din would become a foundation. The doctrine of incremental consolidation. Nur ad-Din's military philosophy rested on three pillars: territorial consolidation before expansion, institutional legitimacy over personal charisma, and economic sustainability over plunder-based warfare. Between 1146 and 1154, he focused on securing his Syrian heartland. Rather than immediately challenging the Crusader states, he first absorbed Damascus, the critical urban center that controlled trade routes between Iraq and Egypt. The Damascus campaign reveals his method. In 1148, he defended the city against the Second Crusade, earning gratitude from its population. He waited 6 years, building alliances within Damascus's merchant class and religious establishment, before the city invited him to assume control in 1154. This was conquest through inevitability, not force. Ibn al-Qalanisi, the Damascene chronicler, noted that the transition occurred without significant bloodshed, a rarity in medieval power transfers. The cost-benefit analysis was clear. A destroyed Damascus would have been a liability. An intact, cooperative Damascus became the economic engine of his state. Logistics as strategy. Modern analysis of medieval warfare often emphasizes battles while overlooking the mundane reality. Armies required food, water, fodder, and coin. Nur ad-Din understood that logistics determined strategic possibility. He implemented a system of supply depots along major military routes, documented in contemporary Waqf endowment records. These weren't merely storage facilities, they were force multipliers. His army could campaign for extended periods without foraging, which meant his soldiers didn't alienate the civilian population they theoretically protected. This contrasted sharply with Crusader armies, which often devastated the countryside they marched through, creating enemies among local populations. The economic historian Andrew Ehrenkreutz, analyzing Ayyubid sources that inherited Nur ad-Din's fiscal system, calculated that his centralized taxation and trade monopolies generated approximately 1.8 million dinars annually by the late 1160s, sufficient to maintain a standing army of roughly 8,000 professional cavalry, without resorting to the extractive taxation that had destabilized previous Muslim dynasties. The psychology of the ascetic commander. Primary sources consistently describe Nur ad-Din's personal austerity. Ibn al-Athir recounts that he wore simple garments and ate plain food, refusing the luxuries available to a man of his position. William of Tyre, the Crusader chronicler and no friend to Muslim rulers, grudgingly admitted that Nur ad-Din was a just prince, valiant and wise, and according to the traditions of his race, a religious man. This wasn't performance, it was policy. By embodying the ascetic ideal valued in Islamic tradition, Nur ad-Din created moral authority that translated into political capital. When he asked Damascus merchants to fund military campaigns, they complied not from fear, but from a belief that their resources would be used judiciously. When he demanded discipline from his soldiers, they obeyed because he held himself to the same standard. The psychological dimension extended to his enemies. Crusader sources reveal a grudging respect that complicated their propaganda efforts. It's difficult to demonize an opponent who demonstrably lives by the ethical codes he claims to uphold. This moral positioning was strategic. It made defection from Crusader service to Nur ad-Din's forces more palatable for local Christians and converted Crusaders, which occurred with documented frequency during his reign. Pragmatism within principle. Nur ad-Din's piety was genuine, yet never allowed to override strategic necessity. In 1157, he allied with the Byzantine Empire against the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, a Christian-Muslim alliance that shocked contemporaries but made perfect strategic sense. The Seljuks threatened his eastern frontier. The Byzantines shared that concern. The alliance lasted only as long as mutual interest dictated, demonstrating that Nur ad-Din's religious convictions didn't preclude realpolitik. Similarly, his treatment of Christian and Jewish populations under his rule followed pragmatic lines. Contemporary tax records show these communities paid the jizya poll tax for non-Muslims, but were otherwise protected and allowed economic participation. This wasn't tolerance in the modern sense. It was recognition that a diverse, productive economy generated more revenue than a homogeneous, impoverished one. The long game. By 1164, when Nur ad-Din began his campaigns into Fatimid Egypt, he had spent 18 years building the infrastructure, political, economic, military, and moral, that would make expansion sustainable. Where his father had conquered through force of personality, Nur ad-Din conquered through force of system. The chronicler Abu Shama later wrote that Nur ad-Din built the structure upon which Saladin would stand. This was his philosophy: create foundations that outlast the founder. In an age of personal empires that collapsed with their creators, Nur ad-Din constructed something rarer, an institutional legacy that would reshape the region for generations. Visual, opening shot of a vast, detailed map of the Levant and Egypt in the mid-12th century, highlighting Nur ad-Din's expanding domains, Crusader states, and the Fatimid Caliphate. Subtle animation shows lines of influence and military movements. Narrator: by the middle of the 12th century, Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi had forged a formidable domain across northern Syria and Mesopotamia. His victories, culminating in the absorption of Damascus in 1154, had transformed him from a regional emir into the preeminent power in the Near East. Yet his ambitions extended far beyond mere conquest. Nur ad-Din possessed a vision for a unified, resilient state capable of confronting the Crusader presence with overwhelming force. This chapter explores the blueprint for that kingdom, an edifice he meticulously designed but ultimately left unfinished. Visual: transition to a CGI reconstruction of 12th century Damascus, showing bustling markets, fortifications, and newly constructed administrative buildings. Focus on details of civic life. Narrator: Nur Ad-Din understood that military might alone could not sustain a lasting dominion. His strategy was holistic, integrating military prowess with sophisticated statecraft. Having inherited a fragmented landscape, he embarked on a systematic program of administrative reform. Justice, often a casualty of protracted conflict, became a cornerstone of his rule. Contemporary chroniclers, such as Ibn al-Athir, frequently laud his commitment to equitable governance, noting how he established Dar al-Adl houses of justice, where he personally heard petitions, bypassing corrupt officials. This was not merely an act of piety. It was a pragmatic move to secure the loyalty of diverse populations and establish a stable internal front. His infrastructural initiatives were equally strategic. He invested heavily in public works, building madrasas, hospitals, and caravanserais along vital trade routes. These institutions served multiple purposes. The madrasas fostered a class of educated administrators and scholars loyal to his authority, while hospitals addressed public health, a critical factor for maintaining a productive populace and a strong army. The caravanserais facilitated trade, boosting the economy that financed his military machine. This deliberate cultivation of internal strength ensured that newly conquered territories were not merely occupied, but integrated, forming a cohesive administrative unit. Nur ad-Din understood that a strong economy and a contented populace were as crucial as formidable fortifications. Visual map again, highlighting the strategic vulnerability of the Crusader states, now sandwiched between Nur ad-Din's territories and the increasingly chaotic Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. Narrator: with his Syrian base consolidated, Nur ad-Din's strategic gaze turned south to Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate, once a powerful rival, had descended into a debilitating internal power struggle, its viziers vying for control while its treasury dwindled. This political vacuum created a dangerous opportunity. For Nur ad-Din, the prospect of the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem seizing Egypt was an existential threat. If Jerusalem controlled both the Levant and the vast resources of Egypt, his ambition for regional dominance, and indeed the security of his own realm, would be irrevocably compromised. The decision to intervene in Egypt was not taken lightly. It represented a monumental logistical challenge, requiring expeditions across hundreds of miles of arid terrain, away from his established supply lines. Yet the strategic imperative was overwhelming. Securing Egypt would encircle the Crusader states, provide immense wealth, and unify the region under a single, dominant authority. Nur ad-Din's brilliance lay in identifying this pivotal geopolitical fulcrum. Visual, animated map showing the routes of Shirkuh's and Amalric's expeditions into Egypt, highlighting the back-and-forth nature of the campaigns. Show logistical challenges, supply lines. Narrator: from 1164 to 1169, Nur ad-Din dispatched his most trusted general, Shirkuh, and his ambitious nephew, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, on 3 arduous campaigns into Egypt. These were not swift invasions, but complex, protracted struggles, often involving a three-way contest between Shirkuh's forces, the Fatimid viziers, and King Amalric I of Jerusalem, who also recognized Egypt's strategic value. The human cost of these expeditions was immense, with armies marching across deserts, engaging in sieges, and suffering from disease and attrition. The expeditions drained Nur ad-Din's treasury and manpower, yet he persisted, demonstrating an unyielding commitment to his grand strategy. The psychological toll on Nur ad-Din himself must have been considerable. Each expedition was a gamble, with the fate of his generals and the immense resources invested hanging precariously. His leadership during this period was characterized by a cold, calculating resolve. He absorbed setbacks, adapted his tactics, and continually reinforced his forces, driven by the singular objective of denying Egypt to the Crusaders and bringing it under his sphere of influence. Visual, close-up on a period depiction of Nur ad-Din, reflecting his austere and disciplined character. Then transition to a depiction of Saladin, perhaps looking more assertive. Narrator: the final, decisive campaign in 1169 saw Shirkuh finally consolidate control over Egypt, becoming the Fatimid vizier. Upon Shirkuh's sudden death, just 2 months later, his nephew Saladin succeeded him. This moment marked a critical juncture in Nur ad-Din's blueprint. He had successfully extended his dominion to Egypt, creating a vast, unified territory stretching from the Tigris to the Nile. This was the strategic encirclement he had envisioned, isolating the Crusader states and setting the stage for their eventual expulsion. However, the very success of his Egyptian venture introduced a new, unforeseen dynamic. Saladin, though initially a loyal subordinate, began to assert his independence. He governed Egypt with growing autonomy, consolidating his power base and building his own army. Nur ad-Din, ever the strategist, observed this development with a blend of satisfaction and apprehension. He had entrusted Saladin with a crucial mission, but the burgeoning power of his protege in distant Cairo began to diverge from his original design. Visual, map showing the vast unified territory under Nur ad-Din's nominal control, but with a subtle indication of Saladin's growing independence in Egypt. Narrator: Nur ad-Din's vision was not merely one of territorial expansion, but of a centralized, unified state under his direct authority. He had meticulously crafted the infrastructure, administrative apparatus, and military doctrine for such a realm. His psychological makeup revealed a leader of profound discipline and strategic foresight, prioritizing long-term objectives over immediate gratification. He was a meticulous planner, a demanding but just ruler, whose life was dedicated to the establishment of a powerful, resilient polity. Yet this carefully constructed edifice remained incomplete. In 1174, as he prepared to march on Egypt to reassert his direct authority over Saladin and perhaps deliver a final, decisive blow to the Crusader states, Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi fell ill and died. His sudden demise, at the age of 59, left a power vacuum and a grand design unfinished. The unified state he had painstakingly built, stretching across the heart of the Near East, was suddenly headless. Visual, final shot of the map, showing Nur ad-Din's vast domain, but with a question mark over the future. The unfinished edifice concept is visually reinforced. Narrator, Nur ad-Din's legacy is complex. He was a master strategist and an exceptional administrator, laying the essential groundwork for a unified front against the Crusaders. His blueprint for a powerful, integrated state was revolutionary for its time, demonstrating a deep understanding of governance, logistics, and long-term geopolitical objectives. Yet the very success of his Egyptian gamble introduced the figure of Saladin, who would ultimately inherit his vision, albeit on his own terms. Nur ad-Din built the foundations, poured the concrete, and erected the walls of a magnificent kingdom, but fate intervened, preventing him from placing the final, crowning stone. The unfinished edifice would now be inherited, and its ultimate destiny decided by others. Chapter 6, Architect or Aspiration. Reassessing the Zengid Foundation. The annals of history often remember Nur ad-Din Mahmud Zengi as a figure of formidable strategic acumen and unyielding resolve. Yet, as we peel back the layers of time, we must ask, was Nur ad-Din an architect of a lasting legacy, or merely an aspirant whose vision outpaced his ability to execute? To answer this, we must delve into the tactical decisions, logistical challenges, and geopolitical context that defined his reign. The foundation of power, tactical decisions, and logistics. Nur ad-Din ascended to power in Aleppo in 1146, inheriting a realm fraught with internal strife and external threats. His strategic vision was shaped by the turbulent landscape of the Levant, where Crusader states, rival Muslim factions, and the ever-present specter of fragmentation loomed large. His first priority was to consolidate power within his own domain. One of Nur ad-Din's most critical tactical decisions was his methodical approach to centralizing authority. Unlike his predecessors, who often ruled through a patchwork of alliances and marital bonds, Nur ad-Din sought to create a cohesive administrative structure. He appointed loyal officials, often from his inner circle, to govern key regions. This approach was not without its challenges. Primary sources like Ibn Kathir's al-Bid'ah, Wan Nihir detail the logistical hurdles Nur ad-Din faced in maintaining supply lines and ensuring the loyalty of distant governors. The constant need to balance military campaigns with administrative oversight was a testament to his strategic foresight. Nur ad-Din's logistical prowess was evident in his ability to sustain prolonged military campaigns. The siege of Damascus in 1154, for instance, required meticulous planning. He ensured a steady flow of supplies, fortified his positions, and employed psychological warfare to wear down the morale of his adversaries. According to chroniclers, his forces were well supplied and disciplined, a rarity in an era where logistics often determined the outcome of conflicts. The geopolitical chessboard, context and constraints. The geopolitical landscape of the 12th century Levant was a complex tapestry of shifting alliances and competing interests. Nur ad-Din's rise coincided with the decline of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt and the fragmentation of the Seljuk Sultanate. To the north, the Crusader states of Edessa, Antioch, and Jerusalem posed a constant threat. To the east, the Archukids and other Turkish dynasties vied for influence. Nur ad-Din's strategic brilliance lay in his ability to navigate this treacherous terrain. He understood that the key to long-term success was not just military conquest, but the forging of alliances and the cultivation of loyal supporters. His marriage to the daughter of the Seljuk Atabeg of Mosul, for example, was a masterstroke of political maneuvering. It not only secured his eastern flank, but also bolstered his legitimacy as a leader. However, Nur ad-Din's ambitions were not without their limitations. His attempts to unify the Muslim world under his banner were often thwarted by the very factions he sought to rally. The chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi, in his Dihal Tariq Dimashq *, notes the frequent rebellions and defections that plagued Nur ad-Din's reign. These challenges highlight the delicate balance between aspiration and reality, between vision and execution. The psychological portrait, leadership and legacy. Nur ad-Din's leadership style was a blend of pragmatism and idealism. He was a man of profound ambition, driven by a vision of a unified Muslim Levant. Yet he was also a realist, well aware of the constraints imposed by geography, logistics, and human nature. His psychological profile is a subject of intense historical debate. Some contemporaries, like the historian Ibn al-Athir, portray him as a stern but just ruler, a man who inspired loyalty through his unwavering commitment to his cause. Others, however, depict him as a harsh and unforgiving leader whose relentless pursuit of power alienated potential allies. Nur ad-Din's legacy is further complicated by his untimely death in 1174. His final years were marked by a series of setbacks, including the loss of key territories to the Crusaders and internal rebellions. Yet, despite these challenges, he never wavered in his belief in the ultimate triumph of his vision. This unwavering resolve is perhaps his most enduring trait, a testament to the indomitable spirit of a leader who, despite the odds, remained steadfast in his pursuit of greatness. Conclusion: architect or aspirant. In reassessing Nur ad-Din's foundation, we are confronted with a complex figure whose legacy is both inspiring and enigmatic. Was he an architect, meticulously crafting a lasting legacy, or merely an aspirant whose vision outpaced his ability to execute? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Nur ad-Din's tactical decisions and logistical prowess were undeniable strengths, as were his strategic insights and political acumen. Yet, the geopolitical constraints and psychological complexities of his era presented formidable challenges. In the end, Nur ad-Din's legacy is one of both achievement and aspiration, a testament to the human cost of war and the brilliance of leadership in a tumultuous age. As we reflect on his life and times, we are reminded of the eternal struggle between vision and reality, between the architect and the aspirant. Nur ad-Din's story is not just a tale of conquest and power, but a profound exploration of the human condition in the face of